The Atlantic was showing off again. From the 58th floor, I could see it stretching all the way to the horizon, that particular shade of blue that only exists in October, when the worst of the Carolina heat has finally given up and gone somewhere else. People pay a great deal of money to live with a view like this. I know, because I set the prices myself. The folder had been sitting on my desk for 4 days. Brown, unremarkable, the kind of envelope a doctor's office might use to mail you results you already suspect but aren't ready to confirm. My assistant Judith had placed it there on Monday without a word. She has worked for me for 20 years, and she understands better than most that there are moments when silence is the only appropriate response. This was one of those moments. I had done everything a person does when they are avoiding something important. I had reorganized the bookshelf behind my desk, alphabetically, then by subject, then alphabetically again. I had reviewed the quarterly reports 2 weeks ahead of schedule. I had called my accountant about a property in Savannah that required no immediate attention whatsoever. I had eaten my breakfast at this desk every morning, pushed papers around the folder as if it were simply another item on a very long to-do list, and told myself I would open it tomorrow. Today was the 4th tomorrow. I am 76 years old. I have negotiated contracts with men twice my size who believed a woman in a boardroom was a decorative element. I have buried my husband, rebuilt his company, and lived alone in this penthouse for 22 years without once feeling sorry for myself. Or at least without allowing anyone to see it if I did. I am not, by any reasonable definition, a woman who is afraid of a piece of paper. I picked up the envelope. It was lighter than it should have been, given everything it contained. $3,500 for a 6-page report and 2 photographs. Frank Bellows had apologized for the cost when he called to tell me it was ready. I told him not to. Information has always been the most expensive thing I purchase, and the most necessary. I opened the flap, slid out the pages, set them on the desk in front of me. The first page was a summary, the way these things always begin. The facts laid out in clean, impersonal type, as though human catastrophe were merely a matter of data. Name, Daniel Roy Hargrove. Age, 29. Parents, Raymond Allen Hargrove and Patricia Sue Hollis Hargrove. Born Portland, Oregon. Current residence, unhoused. Location, vicinity of I-77 overpass, Charlotte, North Carolina. My coffee had gone cold. I pushed it to one side. I read the second page. Daniel had married young, a girl named Amber, whom the report described in careful, neutral language as having departed the family unit when their daughter was 8 months old. The note in parentheses said she had left a handwritten message. The message said she had not been born to be a mother. The report did not editorialize. It didn't need to. The third page was the unraveling. 5 years of construction work, steady employment, a modest apartment in a neighborhood that wasn't beautiful but was safe enough to raise a child. Then the company that employed him filed for bankruptcy with very little warning. Then 3 months of missed rent. Then the landlord, who had been patient longer than most, who had finally run out of patience in August, which was a particularly cruel month to find yourself without a roof. And then, this was the line I read 3 times, slowly, the way you reread something when your eyes understand the words but your mind refuses to accept their arrangement. Subject placed 1 call to father, Raymond Hargrove requesting temporary housing assistance. Call lasted approximately 40 seconds. Request denied. 40 seconds. I set the page down. Looked out at the Atlantic, which continued its performance, indifferent and magnificent. Raymond had let his son stand on the edge of nothing and told him to find his own way down. I turned to the 4th page. There was a note at the bottom, added in Frank Bellows's handwriting rather than typed, a small departure from his usual format that told me he had considered whether to include it and decided he had to. Frank is a careful man, methodical in the way his father was methodical, and he does not add handwritten notes unless he believes they are essential. I read it, then I read it again. Then I sat very still for what I believe was a considerable amount of time, though I couldn't have told you exactly how long. I should tell you about Walter, not the Walter in the obituaries. Walter James Hargrove, founder of Hargrove Homes, pioneer of affordable residential development in the Carolina Lowcountry, beloved husband and father. Though all of that was true. I should tell you about the Walter I knew, the one who existed before he became a name on a building. He grew up in a place called Hartwell, Georgia, which is a small town that has always been more determined than prosperous. His father was a carpenter who taught him that if you built something and it fell down, the problem was yours, and the solution was yours, and you didn't stop until you got it right. Walter took that lesson and applied it to everything he ever touched for the rest of his life. He came to Charleston in 1969 with $200, a set of hand tools his father had given him, and an absolute certainty that he was going to build something that lasted. His first project was a 3-bedroom house for a veteran named Carol Bishop, who had come home from Vietnam to find that the country he'd fought for was not especially interested in helping him find a place to live in it. Walter built that house in 4 months, mostly by himself, for less money than anyone said was possible. Then he built another one, and another. By the time I met him, he was running a small company out of a converted storage room with 1 telephone and a drafting table he'd made himself. He was not wealthy. He was not impressive, if your definition of impressive involved expensive suits, or an ease with social occasions. What he was in a way I have never found in another human being, was completely, entirely honest. Not tactful. Honest. There is a difference, and most people prefer the former. I married him in 1971. We built Hargrove Homes together for 32 years. And then Raymond happened. I am not going to tell you that we didn't see the signs. That would not be true, and I promised myself when I sat down to tell this story that I would not soften the parts that reflect poorly on me. I saw the signs. I saw the way Raymond watched other people, calculating, always calculating, as though every interaction were a transaction, and the only question was how to come out ahead. I saw the way he charmed his father effortlessly, the way Walter's face lit up when Raymond walked into a room, and I saw, though I did not say it aloud, not once, God help me, that Raymond had understood from a very early age that his father's love was the most valuable thing in the house, and that it cost him nothing to exploit it. I told myself it was normal. I told myself boys were complicated and marriages were complicated and families were complicated, and that the tension I felt when Raymond looked at me a certain way across the dinner table was my own anxiety, my own failing, nothing to be concerned about. I was wrong, and the cost of being wrong was everything. The memory always comes in the same order. The front door of our house on Magnolia Drive, the sound of my own key in the lock, the hallway that smelled like the lemon polish Rosa used on the wooden floors every Thursday. The quiet. Walter's car was in the driveway. He should have been home. He should have answered when I called his name from the hallway. He should have appeared at the top of the stairs with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he always did when he was interrupted in the middle of something. The study door was open. He was sitting in his leather chair, facing the open safe in the wall. The safe that should have contained the documents we kept there. The insurance papers, the bonds set aside for grandchildren we had not yet had, the emergency cash Walter insisted on keeping in physical form because he had grown up in a house where the bank's goodwill was not something you could depend on. The safe was empty. He didn't turn when I came in. He just sat there, looking at the emptiness where our security had been. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so flat and so quiet that I had to cross the room to hear him. Raymond took it, he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered in the tone of a man who has just understood something that has rearranged the entire architecture of his world. I called the bank. I called our accountant. I called Raymond's cell phone 16 times. I called Patricia's cell phone. I called the landline at their apartment and listened to it ring and ring in an apartment that I would later learn had been vacated 3 days earlier, the keys left on the kitchen counter, no forwarding address. I turned back to Walter, and I knew before I reached him that something had changed in his face. The doctors called it a massive cardiac event. They said it was not uncommon in men his age, that the blockages had likely been developing for years, that there was nothing. They were very careful about this, very gentle. Nothing that anyone could have done differently. I knew better. I have always known better. Walter Hargrove died in his favorite chair in the home he had built, betrayed by the son who had been the center of his world, and no amount of medical terminology has ever convinced me that those two facts are unrelated. That was 22 years ago. I buried him. I ran the company. I lived in the penthouse I designed after selling the house on Magnolia Drive, because I could not sleep in a house where the smell of lemon polish reminded me of the worst evening of my life. I became, by most external measures, a considerable success. I became, by most internal ones, a ghost. I looked down at Frank Bellows's handwritten note again. Mrs. Hargrove. I want to flag something that fell outside the original scope of the request. Per a former neighbor of the subject's family in Portland, Raymond Hargrove told Daniel from early childhood that both paternal grandparents had died in an accident before he was born. The subject has no knowledge of your existence, no knowledge of Hargrove Homes, and no knowledge of his grandfather's identity or legacy. Additionally, in 2021, Daniel Hargrove submitted an employment application to Hargrove Homes' Charlotte Regional Office for a construction site supervisor position. He was rejected at the resume screening stage due to lack of a bachelor's degree. I read it a third time. My grandson, a young man who had grown up believing he had no family, no history, no roots, had walked up to the front door of his grandfather's company and knocked, looking for work. And we had turned him away without a second glance, without anyone in that office having any idea who was standing in front of them. Raymond had not just stolen our money. He had stolen Daniel's entire history. He had erased Walter from his own grandson's life as completely and deliberately as he had emptied that safe, and then he had watched from whatever comfortable distance he'd arranged for himself, while his son grew up believing he came from nowhere. The 5th page of the report was a photograph. A man, thin, dark-haired, hunched against a concrete pillar under a highway overpass. One arm was wrapped around a bundle pressed against his chest, a bundle too small to be anything other than a very young child. A tiny hand was visible at the edge of the fabric, reaching upward toward the man's face. The hand was the size of a persimmon. I set the photograph down carefully, as though it might be damaged by the pressure of my fingers. I sat for a moment longer. The Atlantic continued its performance. 60 stories below, people moved along the sidewalks, very small and very purposeful, living their complicated lives. Then I pressed the intercom button on my desk phone. "Judith?" "Yes, Mrs. Hargrove." "Get the jet ready. Call Carl in Charlotte and tell him I'll need the car tomorrow morning, and pack my bag for at least a week. Weather appropriate for North Carolina this time of year." A pause. Judith has worked for me for 20 years. She knows better than to ask unnecessary questions, but she is also, underneath her professional composure, a woman with a good heart, and occasionally her good heart overrides her professional composure. "Will anyone be traveling with you?" "No, this is personal." "Of course. Is there anything else you need tonight?" I looked at the photograph one more time, the tiny hand reaching upward. The man's arm curled around his daughter with the particular fierceness of someone who has nothing left to protect except this one thing, and is going to protect it with everything he has. "No," I said. "That will be all." That night, I did something I hadn't done in many years. I went into the room at the end of the hall, the one I keep locked, not with a key, but with the simple discipline of not turning the handle, and I opened it. Walter's study, exactly as it was. I hadn't changed anything after the move. I'd had the furniture brought here, arranged the same way, the drafting table against the east wall, the bookshelves that he'd built himself lining the north wall from floor to ceiling, the leather chair facing the window. I told myself I kept it this way for practical reasons, that the drafting table was useful for reviewing blueprints, that the bookshelves held reference materials I consulted occasionally. That was not the real reason, and I had always known it. I sat in the leather chair. From my jacket pocket, I took out the photograph Frank Bellows had included, the second photograph, the one I hadn't mentioned yet, because I wasn't ready to. Walter had commissioned it himself from a photographer he liked, sometime in the early 1990s. I knew this photograph. I had a copy of it in an album somewhere. Walter and Raymond, father and son, standing in front of the very first Hargrove home on what must have been a cool day because Raymond was wearing a jacket, and he was maybe 10 years old, squinting slightly into the sun, and Walter had his hand on the boy's shoulder. Walter was smiling the way he only smiled when he was completely, unguardedly happy. Frank had found this photograph among the items in Raymond's old storage unit in Portland, sold at auction after Raymond stopped paying the rental fees. Someone had bought the contents, found the photograph among them, and, for reasons that spoke well of human nature, had contacted Bellows Investigations after seeing the inquiry posted in a genealogy forum. Daniel had been carrying a copy of this photograph in his wallet. Not the original, that had turned up in the storage unit, but a copy, creased and soft with handling, tucked inside a piece of plastic wrap to protect it from the elements. The former neighbor who spoke to Bellows had seen it once, when Daniel was maybe 7 years old, showing it to a friend at the end of the driveway. "That's my grandpa," Daniel had apparently said. He died before I was born, but my dad has a picture. Raymond had given him that much. A single photograph, a single thread back to Walter, before apparently thinking better of even that small generosity and replacing it with a lie about an accident that had never happened. I sat in Walter's chair for a long time. He kept your picture, I said, to the room, to the empty drafting table, to the particular quality of silence that exists in a space where someone you loved once spent a great deal of time. All these years, he didn't even know your name, but he kept your picture. I don't know if I believe in the kind of afterlife where a person can hear you talking to them from a leather chair in a Charleston penthouse. I am not, by nature, a sentimental woman, but I waited for a moment after I said it, in case. Then I went to my bedroom, set my alarm for 5 o'clock, and lay down on top of the covers with my clothes on, because I knew I wasn't going to sleep. The jet lifted off the private terminal at 6:47 in the morning. Below, Charleston grew smaller, and then disappeared into the coastal haze, and North Carolina spread out ahead of us, flat and gray and real. I had brought the folder with me. I had also brought a thermos of black coffee and a photograph. Not the one from the report, but one from the album in the study. Walter at 28, kneeling on a roof beam with a hammer in his hand and a grin that took up half his face, looking like a man who had just figured out exactly what he was supposed to do with his life. I set the photograph on the seat across from me where I could see it. "All right, Walter," I said. "Let's go find your boy." The engines hummed. The clouds closed below us like a curtain. We descended into Charlotte 2 hours later, into a sky the color of pewter, and a rain that had apparently decided it was going to be thorough about things. Carl was waiting at the private terminal, umbrella ready, expression neutral in the way of a man who has driven me to 30 cities over 15 years, and long since stopped being surprised by anything I ask him to do. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, holding the door. "Carl." I handed him a folded paper with the coordinates. "Do you know this area?" He glanced at it. "I know of it. How long?" 25 minutes, maybe 30 with this rain." I got into the car. Carl folded the umbrella, closed my door, and walked around to the driver's side without a word about where we were going or why a 76-year-old woman in a cashmere coat was asking to be driven to an underpass in the rain on a Wednesday morning. I have always appreciated that about Carl. We drove through Charlotte, through the glass and steel of the newer downtown, through the neighborhoods that transitioned from maintained to struggling in the way that American cities do, abruptly and without apology, a Starbucks and then a payday loan center and then a Starbucks again. And then we turned east, and the rain thickened against the windshield, and the tires found more potholes, and the buildings got lower and further apart. And then we were on a service road running beneath a roaring concrete overpass, and Carl pulled over onto the shoulder and stopped. "Here," he said quietly. I looked through the rain-streaked window. Against the third concrete pillar, maybe 40 yards away, there was a small tent. Blue tarp stretched between the pillar and a shopping cart that had been wedged sideways to make a frame. Around it, the accumulated evidence of sustained outdoor living. Bags, a plastic storage container with a cracked lid, what looked like a folded piece of carpet serving as a doormat. I could hear, even through the closed windows and the rain and the constant thunder of the highway overhead, a sound. Thin, exhausted. Not the full-throated cry of a child who is angry or wants something. The sound a child makes when they have been crying long enough that the crying itself has become all they know. "Keep the car running," I said. "Mrs. Hargrove." "Carl." He stopped. He knew that tone. I opened my door and stepped into the rain. The rain hit me the moment I stepped out of the car. Not the polite, apologetic rain that Charleston produces in the fall. This was a North Carolina working rain. Purposeful and cold. The kind that soaks through a cashmere coat in under a minute and doesn't particularly care what the coat cost. My heels found the gravel shoulder, then the mud beyond it, and I kept walking. The sound of the child grew clearer as I got closer. I had been to this overpass 100 times in my mind since Monday, reading and rereading Frank Bellows's report, studying the grainy photograph until I had memorized every detail I could make out. I thought I had prepared myself. I had constructed, in the careful and organized way I approach most things, a mental framework for what I was about to do. I would introduce myself. I would explain the situation calmly. I would make a practical offer and give him room to accept it. What I had not accounted for was the smell. Not a dramatic smell, not the kind that belongs in a story about suffering, where everything is heightened and symbolic. Just the particular combination of wet concrete and cold air, and the specific staleness that accumulates when a person has been living in a very small space with very little access to the things most of us consider basic. Warmth, running water, the simple dignity of a door that closes. It stopped me for just a moment, not from revulsion, from recognition. This is real, I thought. This is not a report. This is not a photograph. This is where my grandson has been sleeping. I kept walking. The tent flap was partially open. Inside, a man knelt with his back to me, his spine visible through a t-shirt that had no business being the only layer between him and a 40-degree morning. His shoulders were curved inward around whatever he was holding, the posture of someone who has arranged their entire body into a shield. He was humming, very softly, barely audible under the rain. Something without a melody I could name, just a low rhythmic sound, the kind you make when words aren't enough, and silence is worse. The kind of sound that means I'm here. I've got you. You're not alone. Walter used to hum exactly like that when he was working late, bent over the drafting table, concentrating. The same low, tuneless sound, the same steady rhythm. I stopped just outside the tent. Daniel Hargrove. He spun around so fast that he lost his balance for a half-second, one hand shooting out to catch himself against the ground, while the other arm pulled the bundle tighter against his chest. He was up in an instant, or as close to it as a man can manage in a space that low, putting himself between me and the child without any apparent decision-making. It was pure reflex, the body doing what the body knows, his face. I had looked at his driver's license photo in the report, a flat official image, the kind where the camera catches a person between expressions and produces something that looks like neither them nor anyone else. I had thought I was prepared. I was not prepared for his face, the same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, dark brown, the color of the good soil. Walter used to say you could build anything on if you started with the right foundation. Thinner than Walter, sharper with the particular sharpness that comes from not having enough to eat, and older than 29 in the way that difficult years make a person older. But underneath all of that, underneath the stubble and the weariness and the exhaustion, I could see my husband looking back at me from a face that had never known he existed. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, low, calibrated not to startle the child. "This isn't... We're not bothering anybody. We're just..." "I know," I said. "You're not in any trouble. I'm not here about the tent." He stared at me. His eyes moved from my face to my coat to my shoes, Italian leather, now thoroughly ruined by the mud, and back to my face, trying to assemble these pieces into something that made sense. "Then what are you here about?" "You." I paused. "And her." The child in his arms made a sound. Not the thin, exhausted crying I had heard from the car, but something smaller. A sound that meant the crying had temporarily given way to something worse. The slack quiet of a child who is too tired to cry anymore. Her face was turned into his shoulder, her dark hair damp against her forehead, and even from where I stood I could see the unnatural flush of fever in her cheeks. "She needs a doctor," I said. "You think I don't know that?" The words came out sharp with a frustration that wasn't anger exactly. It was the frustration of a person who knows exactly what is needed and has been unable to provide it, which is a specific and terrible kind of helplessness. "The ER said it's just a cold. They gave me children's Tylenol and..." He stopped, set his jaw. "She's been like this for 3 days. I have a pediatrician," I said. "Dr. Susan Whitfield. I can have her at my hotel within the hour. Private call, no waiting room, no paperwork that concerns you." He looked at me the way people look at things that are too good to be true, which is to say with the particular expression of someone calculating exactly what it's going to cost them. "And what do you want for that?" "I want 1 hour of your time. Tonight, when Lily is comfortable and sleeping, I want to sit across from you and tell you something you don't know." I held his gaze. "If you don't like what you hear, I'll arrange transportation wherever you want to go. No conditions, no strings. People who don't have strings always say they don't have strings. That's fair," I said. "You have no reason to trust me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to make a practical decision for your daughter." He looked down at Lily. Something moved across his face. Not surrender exactly, but the specific moment when a person who has been holding on through sheer stubbornness acknowledges that the stubbornness has costs And one of those costs is a sleep against his shoulder with a fever she has had for 3 days. 1 hour, he said. She sees the doctor first, before we talk about anything. Agreed. He was quiet for a moment, still looking down at her. Lily, he said quietly to me. Her name is Lily. I know, I said. And then, because some things say themselves before you have time to decide whether to say them, Walter would have loved that name. He looked up sharply. Who's Walter? Your grandfather, I said. My husband. The ride to the hotel was 15 minutes. Daniel sat in the back seat with Lily against his chest, one hand under her head, his eyes on the window. Carl drove without comment, the wipers steady against the rain. I sat on the opposite side of the seat and did not look at Daniel directly, because he needed those 15 minutes to adjust to the impossible thing that was happening to him, and the worst thing I could do was press. At some point, reaching into his jacket for a dry cloth to wipe Lily's face, Daniel knocked his backpack off the seat. It fell open when it hit the floor, and several things spilled out. A rolled-up pair of socks, a small zippered bag, a photograph in a piece of plastic wrap. He picked it up quickly, but not before I saw it. I recognized it immediately. I have a copy of that photograph in an album in the study. Walter and Raymond in front of the first Hargrove house on a cool day sometime in the early 90s. Walter's hand on a 10-year-old boy's shoulder. Walter's smile. My breath left me in a way I hope Daniel didn't notice. He tucked the photograph back into the bag and said nothing. I said nothing. But something had shifted in the car. Some invisible acknowledgement that the distance between stranger and family was shorter than either of us had been willing to admit. Dr. Whitfield arrived at the hotel suite 40 minutes after we did. She was efficient and kind in equal measure, which is the combination I have always found most useful in a physician. She examined Lily thoroughly, asked Daniel clear questions that he answered in the clipped, careful way of someone who is terrified but is not going to let the terror show, and delivered her verdict without softening it unnecessarily. Mild pneumonia, she said, folding her stethoscope away. Not dangerous at this stage, but she needs antibiotics immediately, and she needs warmth and rest and proper hydration. She looked at Daniel. You got her here just in time. Daniel nodded. His jaw was very tight. Will she be all right? With proper care, absolutely. I've brought antibiotics to start tonight. She should show significant improvement within 48 hours. Dr. Whitfield glanced at me. I understand you may be traveling soon. I'll provide detailed care instructions. After she left, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed where Lily was sleeping, her small chest rising and falling with a steadiness that already seemed easier than it had been under the bridge. He had not let go of her hand. He was looking at it the way people look at things they have come very close to losing. I sat in the chair by the window and waited. You said 1 hour, he said without looking up. I did. Then talk. I folded my hands in my lap. Outside, the rain continued against the glass. Your grandfather's name was Walter James Hargrove, I said. He was born in Hartwell, Georgia, in 1941. He came to Charleston in 1969 with $200 and a set of hand tools and the absolute conviction that he was going to build something that lasted. I paused. He was right. He spent 32 years building a residential development company called Hargrove Homes. He built it from one house to one of the larger firms in the Carolina region. He died in 2003. Daniel said nothing. He was listening in the still, careful way of someone who has learned that the world occasionally drops important information without warning, and that the only sensible response is to hold very quiet and take it in. Your father is Raymond Hargrove, I continued. Raymond was our only child. He was... I stopped, chose the honest words. He was gifted and charming, and he understood from a young age that his father's love was unconditional, and he used that understanding as a tool. I looked at my hands. 11 days before Walter died, Raymond transferred $2.3 million from our joint accounts and the company's operating reserve into accounts we didn't know existed. Then he closed those accounts, packed whatever he and Patricia could carry, and left without a word. Silence. My husband found out alone in his study on a Tuesday evening. My voice stayed level. I have told this story exactly twice before, both times to lawyers, and I have never told it the way I'm telling it now, plainly, without the protective shell of legal language or professional distance. He had a massive cardiac event. The doctor said the blockages had been building for years. They were very careful to explain that it wasn't caused by anything that happened that evening. But you don't believe that, Daniel said quietly. No, I said. I don't. He was quiet for a long time. Lily stirred slightly in her sleep, and his thumb moved in a small circle on the back of her hand. I called him, he said finally. 8 months ago, when Amber left and I lost the apartment, I called my father. He looked up at me for the first time since I'd started talking. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what was happening. I told him about Lily. A pause. He said, "You made your choices. Don't call this number again." And he hung up. The room was very quiet. I know, I said. You knew he did that? I knew he was capable of it. I met his eyes. I didn't know you existed until 4 days ago, Daniel. If I had known... I stopped. Started again. I hired an investigator 3 weeks ago because something woke me at 3 in the morning and wouldn't let me sleep. I don't know what to call that. I don't know if it means anything. But I want you to know that the moment I opened that report, I was on a plane. He studied my face for a long moment. Frank Bellows noted something else in his report, I said. Something I want you to hear from me rather than reading it yourself. I kept my voice steady. Your father told you that both your paternal grandparents died in an accident before you were born. Yes. That was a lie. Walter knew you existed. I watched something shift behind his eyes. He found out through his own channels, sometime when you were young. He tried to make contact. He sent a letter to your address in Portland. I paused. A letter with a photograph inside it. Daniel went completely still. There was a note in Frank's report, I said carefully, from a neighbor who remembered seeing you with the photograph when you were about 7. You told her friend that your grandfather had given it to you. I looked at him. You said he'd died before you were born, which is what Raymond told you. Daniel's hand had stopped moving on Lily's. He was staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder. I kept it, he said, very quietly, almost to himself. When my dad found the envelope, he took it away, but I'd already taken the photo out. I hid it in my sock. A short silence. I've had it since I was 7 years old, and I never even knew his name. The room held its breath. I opened my bag. I took out the envelope I had brought from Charleston, the one Judith had found in Walter's personal safe when I asked her to open it before I left, the one I hadn't been sure I was ready to show him yet. I placed it on the bed beside his hand. Walter wrote you a letter, I said. He never sent it because Raymond kept moving, and Walter died before he could find the right address. I stood up. I'll give you some time. Wait. His voice stopped me at the door. He was looking at the envelope. Why are you doing this? All of this. Why does it matter to you now, after 22 years? I thought about Walter in his study. I thought about the drafting table and the empty safe and the hand reaching toward me too late. I thought about a 7-year-old boy hiding a photograph in his sock because it was the only piece of his grandfather he would ever be allowed to have. Because you've been alone in this family long enough, I said. And so have I. I closed the door quietly behind me. In the hallway, I stood with my back against the wall and I listened to the rain, and I did not allow myself to think about what he was reading, because some moments belong entirely to the person living them. And the only decent thing an old woman who has spent 22 years being a ghost can do is stay out of the way. After a while, the rain eased. Through the door, I heard nothing. And then, very softly, I heard Daniel Hargrove begin to cry. Hargrove Estate appeared through the car windows the way it always does. Slowly, the long driveway giving you time to understand what you're approaching before you arrive. Live oaks on both sides, their branches meeting overhead in a canopy that filters the afternoon light into something softer than it has any right to be in October. Then the house itself, white columns and wide verandas and windows that catch the sun like they were designed specifically for that purpose, which they were. Walter designed them that way. He said a house should welcome the light in, not keep it out. I watched Daniel's face as we came around the final curve. He was holding Lily against his shoulder. She had slept most of the flight from Charlotte, the antibiotics already doing their quiet, competent work. And he was looking through the window with an expression I recognized, though I had not seen it in a very long time. It was the expression Walter used to wear when he finished a project he was proud of. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. The look of a person encountering something that is exactly what it should be. Your grandfather built this house the year before we married, I said. He poured the foundation himself. He said he wanted to know the ground it stood on. Daniel didn't respond right away. He was still looking. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, he said finally. Then, with the particular self-consciousness of someone who has said something more honest than they intended, I mean the architecture. I know what you mean, I said. Rosa was waiting at the front door. She had worked at Hargrove Estate for 19 years, and she had heard enough of its history to understand, without being told, that the young man stepping out of the car with the baby on his shoulder was not a guest in the ordinary sense. She took one look at Daniel's face, at the jaw and the eyes and the something of Walter in the way he stood, and I saw her press her lips together briefly in the way she does when she is managing an emotion she has decided not to display. "Welcome home," she said, which was more than I had asked her to say, and exactly right. The first 3 days, Daniel kept mostly to the east wing. I had given him the guest suite that looked out over the garden, neutral colors, good light, a connecting room where Lily's crib was set up. Rosa reported that he was eating well, that Lily was improving rapidly, that he spent the mornings sitting in the window seat watching the garden with the particular stillness of someone whose nervous system is slowly remembering that it is allowed to rest. I gave him space. I have made many mistakes in my life, but I understand the difference between presence and pressure, and Daniel had spent the last year of his life with no shortage of pressure and a significant shortage of the former. On the 4th evening, I was in the sitting room with one of Walter's old photo albums when I became aware of someone in the doorway. Daniel stood there in a clean shirt. Rosa had quietly restocked the guest room dresser, with the baby monitor in one hand and an expression that said he had been standing there for a moment trying to decide whether to interrupt. "May I?" he said. "Please." I set the album aside and poured him tea the way I had noticed he took it. No sugar, a small amount of milk. He accepted it with a nod and sat in the chair across from mine, and for a moment we simply occupied the same room in the comfortable silence of two people who have already said the most difficult things and can now afford to be quiet. "I walked down to the pond this afternoon," he said, "with Lily. She tried to eat a leaf." "She has Walter's curiosity," I said before I could decide whether to say it. Daniel smiled. It was a brief smile, careful, like someone testing weight on a floorboard they aren't sure will hold. But it was real, and it was Walter's smile, and it cost me something to keep my expression steady. I slid the photo album across the table. "Did you know your grandfather built houses with his own hands before he ever managed a company?" Daniel leaned forward. "My father never talked about him, about either of you." I opened the album to the photograph I had always loved most. Walter at 28, kneeling on a roof beam with a hammer and that enormous uncomplicated grin, looking like a man who has just discovered exactly what he is supposed to do with his life. He grew up poor. His father was a carpenter who taught him the trade and taught him something more important than the trade. That if you built something and it fell down, the problem was yours to fix, and you didn't stop until you got it right. Daniel studied the photograph. His fingers hovered just above the surface of the page, not quite touching. "He looks happy," he said. He was happiest when he was making something. I turned the page. A row of modest houses on a flat street, each one identical and solid and plain. These were the first Hargrove properties. Nothing grand, but Walter used to say, "We don't build houses. We build the place where a family feels safe." He said it so often it became the company's founding statement. I paused. He believed it completely. That was the thing about Walter. He never said anything he didn't believe completely. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came to find us?" he asked. "Because of what he believed?" I considered the question honestly. Partly, and partly because I have been a ghost in my own life for 22 years, and it was time to stop. I looked at him steadily. "Your father took a great deal from this family, Daniel. He took money, and he took Walter's peace of mind, and he took years. I can't get any of that back. But you're here. Lily's here. That's something I can do something about." 6 weeks after Daniel arrived at Hargrove Estate, I made him an offer. We were on the back porch, Lily in her high chair working seriously on a piece of toast, the October morning doing its best impression of a painting. I had been thinking about how to frame it since the 2nd week, and I had decided that the only way to frame it was plainly. "Hargrove Homes has 100 agents who can sell a 4-bedroom house," I said. "What we don't have is enough people who understand what makes it a home." Daniel looked up from helping Lily with her sippy cup. You've lived without one, I continued. You know what a family actually needs in a house in a way that no business school teaches and no amount of market research captures. I set my coffee cup down. There's an entry-level project assistant position open. The salary is market rate. You would start at the bottom, same as everyone else. No one at the company would know who you are unless you choose to tell them. Your success or failure would be entirely your own. He was quiet for a moment, watching Lily. I don't have a degree, he said. I don't have any real estate experience. Neither did Walter when he built his first house. I paused. You have something more valuable. You have perspective. And you know how to build things with your hands, which means you understand what you're selling in a way most of our project managers never will. He looked out at the garden. A long silence. If I fail, he said, I want you to let me fail. No intervention. No smoothing things over. Agreed. And I want to find my own place to live within 6 months. I can't, he stopped. This has to be something I build, not something I'm given. I wouldn't have it any other way, I said. And I meant it. He started on a Monday. I made sure I was not in the building. What I learned afterward, from sources I will not name because I promised Daniel I would not interfere, was that he spent his first 3 weeks reading every file in the project archive, arriving before anyone else and leaving after most of the staff had gone. His direct supervisor, a demanding man named Phil Garrett, who had been with the company for 15 years and was not known for his patience with junior staff, told a colleague at the end of month 2 that the new kid was the most thorough person he had hired in a decade. I received his performance evaluations along with all the others. I read them the way I read all of them, without special attention, without allowing myself the indulgence of pride until I had read them the same way twice. Then I allowed myself the indulgence of pride. By his second year, Daniel had moved into junior sales. I happened to be at the main office one afternoon, genuine business, nothing to do with him, when I passed the glass-walled conference room and saw him inside with a young couple. Teachers, I learned later. First home, new baby, limited budget. The particular combination of hope and anxiety that attends every first-time buyer. I should have kept walking. I stopped. Daniel had pushed the listing sheets to one side. He was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, asking questions that had nothing to do with square footage or school district rankings. What's the most important room in your current apartment? Who gets up first in the morning? Describe a Sunday that felt exactly like what you want your life to feel like. The couple looked startled at first. This was not how house hunting usually went. And then something relaxed in them, and they started to answer honestly. And I watched Daniel listen in that still, complete way of his and take notes, and I thought, Walter, that is exactly what Walter used to do. I walked away before he could see me. 18 months into his time at Hargrove Homes, Daniel found the folder. He had been working late in the project archive, pulling historical files for a market analysis, when he came across a set of blueprints from 2001. The drafting was unmistakable. Walter's hand, precise and slightly impatient, the way it always was when he was working on something he cared about deeply. The project was called Hargrove Cornerstone. 40 homes for working families, priced below market, designed without luxury finishes, but with extraordinary attention to the details that actually affect daily life. Wide hallways, generous storage, a community green space between every cluster of 4 houses, a shared workshop building where residents could use tools. It had been canceled in 2002. The board minutes showed the vote, 7-2 against, on the grounds of insufficient projected return. The name attached to the motion to cancel was Raymond Hargrove, Vice President of Development. Daniel brought the folder to me that evening. He set it on my desk without a word and watched my face as I opened it. I had known about Cornerstone. I had been there when Walter presented it to the board, had watched Raymond argue methodically against it, had assumed at the time that Raymond's objections were simply the cold calculations of a businessman who had not inherited his father's idealism. I had not understood until this moment, looking at Daniel's face across my desk, that Raymond had known exactly what he was doing, that canceling Walter's most personal project had been part of the same deliberate dismantling that ended with an empty safe and a man dying alone in his study. He killed it on purpose, Daniel said, not a question. Yes, I said, I believe so. A silence. I want to build it, Daniel said. He presented Hargrove Cornerstone to the full board 8 months later. He did not tell them whose project it had originally been. He presented it as new work, his own market research, his own design modifications, his own financial projections. The numbers were compelling. The need was real. The demand for affordable family housing in the Charleston region had grown by 34% in 5 years, and Hargrove Homes had not built a single unit in that segment. The board asked hard questions. Daniel answered every one of them without hedging, without overselling, without the particular nervous energy of someone who needs the approval. He answered the way Walter answered questions, directly, completely, as though the truth of the thing was sufficient and didn't require decoration. The vote was 7-2 in favor. Afterward, when the room had emptied, Daniel walked to where I was sitting at the end of the table. "You knew it was his project," he said, "from the beginning." "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him steadily. "Because if I had told you, you would have built it for him. I wanted you to build it because you knew it was right." I paused. "There's a difference." Walter always said there was a difference. Daniel stood there for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the nod of someone who has just understood something they will carry for the rest of their life. The morning before the Cornerstone groundbreaking, Judith's voice came through my intercom with a careful neutrality that told me, before she said a word, that something had happened. "Mrs. Hargrove, there's a man and a woman in the lobby. They say they want to see Daniel. They say they're his parents." I sat very still. The Charleston Post had run a feature on Cornerstone 2 days earlier. Daniel's name, his photograph, his title, Senior Project Manager, Hargrove Homes. Raymond had apparently read it. "Tell them to wait," I said. "I'll come down." I took the elevator alone. 17 floors, and I spent every one of them remembering things I had spent 22 years working to set aside. Raymond was standing near the reception desk when the doors opened. Thinner than I remembered, gray at the temples, wearing clothes that had once been expensive. Patricia stood slightly behind him, her chin up in the way of someone who has decided that dignity is a performance, and they are going to perform it regardless of the audience. Raymond turned when he heard the elevator. His face did the thing faces do when they encounter something they were not prepared for, a rapid, involuntary recalibration, the mask slipping and then being hurriedly replaced. "Mother," he said. "Raymond." A silence that contained 22 years of things neither of us was going to say in a hotel lobby. "We saw the article," Patricia said, filling the silence with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has long been in the habit of managing uncomfortable situations. "We thought it was time to—" "I know why you're here," I said. Raymond's expression shifted towards something that might, in another person, have been shame. "We just want to see him. He's our son. Whatever happened between you and me, happened between you and your father," I said. "And your father is dead." The lobby was quiet. The young woman at the reception desk had found something urgent to look at on her computer screen. "I have spent 22 years, I said, keeping my voice level and low, "watching Hargrove Homes become something Walter would have been proud of. I have watched your son walk into this building with nothing and build something real through his own work. I will not allow you to walk in here the day before the most important day of his career and remind him of every reason he has to feel like the ground beneath him is unreliable." Raymond opened his mouth. "I'm not finished." I reached into my jacket and placed an envelope on the reception desk between us. Inside that envelope is a letter, not from me, from Daniel. He wrote it 2 weeks ago when Judith told him you might eventually find your way here. He knows I'm having this conversation. He chose not to have it himself. I looked at Raymond directly. "He is not ready to see you. He may never be ready to see you. That is his decision entirely, and I will not influence it in either direction. But I will tell you this once, clearly. You approach him or Lily before he reaches out to you, and I will ensure that the documentation Frank Bellows compiled about the 2001 transfers becomes a matter of public record. The statute of limitations may have run. Your reputation hasn't." Patricia made a sound. Raymond looked at the envelope, then at me. Then at something past my shoulder that I did not turn to look at. "He has Walter's eyes," Raymond said very quietly. Whether it was an observation or an apology or something he simply needed to say out loud, I couldn't tell. Perhaps he couldn't either. "Yes," I said. "He does." Raymond picked up the envelope. He and Patricia walked to the door without another word, and I watched them go. And when the glass doors closed behind them, I stood alone in the lobby and felt for the first time in 22 years that the weight I had been carrying was a size I could manage. Behind me, the elevator opened. Daniel stepped out with Lily on his hip. Lily was wearing a yellow dress and carrying, for reasons she had not explained to anyone, a single plastic dinosaur. He looked at my face. He looked at the door. "She's gone?" he said. "They're gone," I said. He nodded. He crossed the lobby and stood beside me, and for a moment we both looked at the glass doors and the Charleston street beyond them, ordinary and bright in the morning sun. "You okay?" he asked. I considered the question honestly, the way Walter would have wanted me to. "Yes," I said. "I think I actually am." Lily held the dinosaur out toward me with great seriousness. I accepted it. She seemed satisfied with this and turned her attention to the buttons on Daniel's shirt. "Rosa made biscuits," Daniel said. "She made about 400 of them. I think she's nervous about tomorrow." "Rosa makes biscuits when she's happy," I said. "She makes 400 of them when she's very happy." Daniel smiled, that real smile, the one that costs him nothing because it comes from somewhere that hasn't been damaged. Walter's smile. "Come on then," he said. "Let's go home." The Hargrove Cornerstone groundbreaking happened on a Tuesday in November, which is the best kind of day in Charleston. Cool and clear, the sky the particular hard blue that only appears after summer has fully given up. The first family to break ground was a woman named Beverly Patterson, a nurse who had raised 2 sons alone after her husband left, who had been on a housing wait list for 3 years. She stood in front of the lot where her house would be built, and she cried without any apparent embarrassment. And her older son, maybe 14, already taller than she was, put his arm around her and also cried, and pretended he wasn't. Daniel shook their hands, said the same thing he had said to every family at every groundbreaking since. "This is your home. We'll build it like it is." I stood at the back of the small crowd. I had brought Walter's photograph, the one from the roof beam, the hammer and the grin. I did not show it to anyone. I simply held it, in my coat pocket, my thumb against the edge of the frame. There, I thought. There it is, what you started. Lily found me at the back of the crowd the way she always finds me, with the unerring instinct of a 2-year-old who has decided that a particular person belongs to her. She pushed through the legs of several adults without apology and arrived at my side and raised her arms. I picked her up. She settled against my shoulder with the absolute confidence of someone who has never doubted they would be caught, and looked out at the crowd and the flags and the turned earth of the lot where Beverly Patterson's house would be. And then she looked at me with Walter's eyes. "Grandma Ellie," she said, "what are we building?" I looked out at the lot. At Daniel, standing in the November sun, talking with Beverly's son with the easy attentiveness of someone who has finally found the work he was made for. At the flags marking the corners of 40 foundations. At the live oaks along the street, the same kind of trees that lined the driveway of Hargrove Estate, standing the way they had been standing for 100 years, rooted and patient and entirely unconcerned with the things that had tried to cut them down. "Something that lasts," I said. Lily considered this. Then she nodded, with the gravity of someone who has received a satisfactory answer, and put her head down on my shoulder. I held her a little tighter. In my pocket, my thumb rested against the edge of Walter's photograph. The November sun was warm on both our faces. We were home.